Hello and welcome to Recovery Cave. My name's Christian and today is part two of my personal story. Now, part one ended with me blowing 5 times the legal limit at the side of the road, being handcuffed and then put in the back of a police car. Part two covers a 22-month period from December 2014 to October 2016 and charts a period of my life that retrospectively feels like a hopeless wilderness in many ways, but actually contained many important moments that all took me a little bit closer to recovery. As I was lying in my work suit on the weird blue mattress in the police cell, my denial was still working overtime. I remember thinking, I can probably style this out. It will be okay, and I'll be back at work tomorrow. I mean, maybe I was still in shock. That would be the less embarrassing option. And I didn't leave the police station until much, much later that day because my alcohol levels just weren't dropping quickly enough. In the time between the incident and the court date, I declared myself bankrupt. And I didn't think I could do this previously as I worked in a bank, but I'd found out before returning to work that I could. And this should have been a massive relief and a huge step forward for me. It was 76 grand of debt wiped away, but actually, I just remember feeling a sense of failure, and it was really surreal. It was like I was a passenger in someone else's life. The court date came around, it was at the end of December, and the judge I got was renowned for being very harsh. And I was told that the sentencing for drink driving was largely done on the number that you blew, so that wasn't a good omen. There was a good chance that I could end up in prison, but in the event, I got lucky. I ended up with a 12-week sentence, but it was suspended for 12 months. And I also got a 3-year driving ban. And the judge said that it was a miracle that I got as far as I did without killing myself or someone else. And she was absolutely right. I could have easily killed someone that day, and that would have effectively ended my life as well. And the day after the court case, I was back at home and I started getting loads of text messages through from friends, generally quite supportive messages. Um, but I didn't understand how they knew what had happened. But it turned out there was a court reporter in the court, and I'd ended up front page news. I was all over all the local papers and on the little boards outside the paper shops. And I'll never forget the headline that read, "Banker 5 times over limit escapes jail." And that just completely sent me through the floor. The first few months of 2015 are a bit blurry. I remember I was off work, long term sick, and my parents had been very supportive. And my girlfriend had also stayed with me. She'd stayed with me through the crash, the bankruptcy, the court case, and all the newspaper mess. But her patience with me was starting to wear pretty thin. There'd been a couple of incidents where she'd come home from work to find me passed out on the bed next to a bottle of vodka when I should have been looking after her kids. Now, luckily, her brother was over on both occasions, just in case something like that happened, which I'd said wasn't necessary at all. And one day she finally snapped and drove me back to my parents and left me there and told them that she just couldn't deal with me anymore. And I was actually quite angry. I had zero right to be, but I felt that she still owed me because I'd taken her on holiday and bought her lots of nice things, which gives you an insight into the general way I was thinking at the time. I think it's pretty safe to say that I was feeling pretty low by this point. I couldn't really comprehend how I'd got into the situation I was in. I'd lost my license, narrowly avoided prison, been front page news. My girlfriend had left me, and now I was back in my old bedroom at my parents' house, with the curtains drawn, still completely at the mercy of alcohol. So, in an attempt to escape my own life for a bit, I decided to book myself a 2 week all inclusive holiday to Turkey. And it actually went surprisingly well. I made a fair few friends there, drank all day, and the resort had a 24-hour bar, so I never had to worry about running out of alcohol. When I returned home, reality hit even harder. Everything just seemed hopeless. I couldn't see a way out. The holiday to Turkey had been a lovely distraction, but that's all it had been. It hadn't fundamentally changed anything at all. But the distraction had been lovely, and I wanted more of it. I wanted more escape. So, within 2 weeks of being back home, I'd booked myself another 2 week all inclusive holiday to Turkey. Now, the second trip to Turkey didn't go so well. The story's too long to tell in full here, so I'll do that in another video. But in summary, this resort didn't have a 24-hour bar, and that turned out to be a big problem. I really struggled to eat, and I really struggled with the heat. The few drinking friends that I did make went home after the first week, and I can't really remember much at all about the second week. But at the end of the holiday, I had to be physically removed from my apartment. And when I landed back in the UK, I was pushed through passport control in a wheelchair. I was covered in bruises. I weighed under 8 stone. I'm 10.5 stone now. And really, I was incredibly lucky to be back in the UK at all. Now, the day after I got home, my parents insisted that I go to see the doctor. And the doctor was very concerned about the state that I was in. I was massively underweight, covered in bruises, and still very much alcohol dependent. And he offered to write a letter to the hospital recommending that I be admitted for a medical detox. And at the time, I wasn't fully sure what that meant, but I knew that I was in a mess. And I also knew that I just wanted to feel okay for a bit. So I accepted his offer. And the next day, I went along to the hospital along with my parents and ended up getting admitted. And this is something I'll need a full video again to describe in full detail, but it was really surreal. I was hooked up to 2 drips for several days, and I was put on various different medications, including Librium, which is something that is used in alcohol withdrawal. And the nausea and the overall withdrawals were still pretty horrendous for the first couple of days, but the Librium, along with some anti-sickness injections, which were like magic, made the whole process a little bit more bearable. And whilst I was in the hospital, I was also visited by an alcohol liaison nurse. Now, she asked me how I ended up in the hospital and about my drinking, and offered to refer me through to community services for alcohol related support, which I accepted. And after spending 6 nights in hospital, I was finally discharged. And it had been the longest I'd gone without alcohol in over 16 years. My family were all very relieved. I'd been really ill, but now I was back home. I was looking better, eating properly. I'd accepted an offer of help, and I was sober. But my plan wasn't to remain sober, much to their dismay. My plan was to stay sober for 2 or 3 weeks and then to drink normally, because I never wanted to stop drinking completely, despite what I'd put myself through. I just wanted to drink like I used to, but just without all the horrible complications. I felt like the hospital detox would act like a reset for my body, and I'd make sure that I didn't find myself on another slippery slope again, because that would be very silly. I was still happy to engage with the help and support though, and I thought that that was a sensible compromise that everyone would be happy with. But apparently, I was the only one that thought that my plan was workable. And I did engage with support. I went to the support services in Colchester, which were at the time in a lovely old grade 2 listed building with a big garden. And I went to support groups there, and my dad would drop me off and then pick me up a couple of hours later. I also stayed sober for a couple of weeks and made out that I was fine, but the reality was alcohol was almost constantly on my mind, and I couldn't wait to announce to my family that I was going to drink normally again. But unfortunately, it didn't take long for my normal drinking to include things like smuggling a bottle of vodka back home after a support group. And within about 3 weeks of me drinking normally, I was back to being completely physically dependent on alcohol again. And I couldn't really hide that for very long. So, alcohol, once again, had total control over me. I remember being very ashamed and also feeling really shocked at just how quickly I'd become physically dependent again. But I was determined that alcohol wasn't going to beat me. I was going to find a way of getting alcohol back on my terms again. It hadn't occurred to me at this point that I'd never really dealt with alcohol on my terms at all. Alcohol had total control of me long before it had control over my body, but I wouldn't realise that until I managed to untangle my denial, and at this point, that was still a long way away. So I came up with various cunning plans where I could cut my drinking down to the point where I'd no longer be dependent. I had this magic figure of 13 units in my head, and I have no idea why. I made a gradual reduction plan, and I made a spreadsheet for it and followed it really closely. And I found it the other day, and here it is. It might look a bit complicated, but basically, the green bits are me doing well, and the red bits are me doing not so well. I found that I could get down to roughly 2 bottles a day, but even at that level, I was feeling constantly nauseous and shaky and weak. And I just couldn't seem to get any further than that. I also tried buying dodgy diazepam online, as I'd heard that works a little bit like Librium, and I was going to self detox using that. Just a word of warning though, do not ever try this. It was a horrible mess and it did not work. I managed to break a toilet seat and also cracked several of my ribs falling into the bath. And my mum and dad had been looking into moving house for some time at this point, and that was purely so I could be closer to transport links, because at the time I was still employed by Lloyd's and they'd actually been really understanding and very supportive. And the plan was still for me to go back to work at some point. So in December 2015, we moved to Harwich, and that was purely for me. And there was a sort of workshop in the back garden of the new house. And the guy that lived there before had built it for his projects. And it had its own little toilet and a tiny kitchen area. And this would effectively become my new tiny house, or my chalet, as I like to call it. By January 2016, I was really ill again. I'd really enjoyed having my own space, but that obviously wasn't the answer by itself. I don't remember it, but apparently I was not making very much sense. I wasn't eating and I was sleeping all the time. And presumably, when I wasn't sleeping, I would have been drinking. And I had been lined up for a community detox. But in order to get that, you had to go along to a number of support sessions first. And I just hadn't been well enough to attend them. So, out of desperation and hoping it might fix me, my parents borrowed £10,000 and booked me into rehab for 4 weeks. So, rehab is another tale that's too long to tell here in full, and I'll do that in another video. But probably the biggest revelation for me was finding myself in a room with loads of other people that thought in the same weird way that I did. It was like being in a room full of people that you find have the same niche hobby that you do, and suddenly you've got this opportunity to talk about it. I also went to my first AA and NA meetings whilst I was in rehab because they were mandatory. But I didn't take them particularly seriously, to be honest. And I did also do the first 3 steps of the 12-step program of AA. And considering I was pretty anti AA at the time, I have to admit that the first 2 steps, at least, made a lot of sense. After rehab, I did go to my local AA meeting once, and it was pretty good. The people there were really welcoming, and I found myself sharing a fair bit of my story up to that point. But something inside me told me that I didn't need it, and I still didn't need them. I thought that AA was for people that weren't clever enough to find their own way through, and people that needed basically bashing over the head once a week and reminding that they're alcoholics. Now, I thought I could still stay sober, but I could do it by myself. And I think that I managed about 2 months of sobriety. But in that time, I did acquire something quite lovely. One of the people I'd been in rehab with had a cat, and I saw on Facebook that the cat had kittens. And all of a sudden, I thought that a recovery kitten would be a brilliant idea. So I got little Axo. Just look at him. And he's a lot bigger these days and lives with my mum. And he didn't turn out to be a sobriety kitten after all, because he's 10 years old and my recovery is not. So, yeah, it turns out that even the cutest of kittens can't cement your recovery. And in those 2 months of sobriety, the voices in my head had been busy again, telling me things like I could just drink at weekends or I could just drink to unwind. Now, if I'd really believed this, then I would have told my parents that that was my plan. But I didn't do that. I started drinking secretly again. And quite predictably, within around 3 weeks, I was completely dependent again. By mid June, I was in a total state whilst trying to do a cold turkey detox, which I'd been advised against doing. My mum was very worried, called 999, and I found myself in the back of an ambulance back on my way to hospital. And I remember waking up in hospital the next day with a mixture of shock, fear, nausea, and relief. I couldn't believe that I'd ended up there again, but I knew I was safe in hospital and I knew they'd take care of me. And for the next 5 days, that's what they did. Whilst I was in hospital, I had another medical detox. I saw the alcohol liaison nurse again, and she referred me through to community alcohol services again. And just like before, I went to support groups for a while, and then my trips into Colchester became support groups, followed by several glasses of wine in the pub. And later than that, they became just trips to the pub, followed by grabbing a bottle of vodka on the way home. I put myself through cold turkey detoxes on a number of occasions, and they were absolutely horrendous. And after each one, my head still miraculously came up with reasons as to why my next attempt at drinking would go differently from all the others. And it was like being in a slow motion car crash. Part of me knew what was going to happen, but I just had to watch it all unravel in front of me while seemingly having no control of it whatsoever. It was excruciating. It must have been unbearable for my parents and my brother and sister. I've used this metaphor over the years many times with my clients to try and explain it. It was like I'd decided to take on this huge guy, twice my size, in a boxing match. And I told my family about this, and they were understandably very worried and tried to talk me out of it. But I said, don't worry, I've got this. So I get in the ring with him, and he beats the shit out of me and hospitalizes me, as anyone could have predicted. And my family come to see me in hospital, and they're all really concerned, but just thankful I'm alive. And then a couple of months later, when I've recovered, I gather my family round again and I say, look, I know it didn't go well last time, but I've got a new plan and I think I can take him. And they'd be like, sorry, what? Did you? We saw what happened last time. Now, you imagine gathering them round for the fifth, sixth, or seventh time. They're going to be incredibly confused at best, but that's essentially what I was doing every time. So that takes us to October 2016. And my parents had been planning to go on holiday with my auntie and uncle, but predictably, I was in a total state again. But my sister convinced my mum and dad to go on the holiday and said that if I needed help, then she would step in. And after a few days on my own, I was in a very dark place indeed. I was in acute withdrawal and I felt completely alone. I'd run out of alcohol and I just didn't feel well enough to leave the house to go and get any. And I really was feeling so bad that I didn't think that cold turkey would be a very good idea this time. So I called an ambulance. But whilst the ambulance was on its way, I was scrambling around trying to find some things to take to hospital with me. And I came across a full bottle of vodka under my bed that I'd totally forgotten about. So, in desperation, I just opened it and glugged a load. So, the ambulance came and picked me up, but by the time I was there, my withdrawals had died right down, and I was actually feeling relatively okay. Now, I remember being assessed at the hospital by a rather cynical doctor and him saying, "I've read your notes. I know all about your past." And I knew then I was very unlikely to get admitted. And then he told me that I wasn't in withdrawal, which was right, to be fair. And I remember saying, "I will be soon, though." But I was discharged and I was effectively told off for wasting their time and told not to come back again. And I was lucky to be getting a ride home in an ambulance. So I got back, fell back onto my bed, and I felt really dejected and actually quite angry, although I arguably didn't really have any right to be angry. But at least I still had that half bottle of vodka. And next week's video will be the third and final part of my story, and that's called Recovery. So things do get better in the end. If they didn't, I wouldn't be here. But if you don't want to miss that, subscribe to the channel. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could give it a like, that will really help the channel grow, and I'd really appreciate it. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.